Hello everyone, I'm glad you're here with me tonight. The story I'm about to share is not one of those made-up tales you hear to give you a little thrill before bed. No, this one comes from an email I received from a listener, and it's been haunting me ever since. Let's dive in, but be warned, this isn't for the faint-hearted. I've always considered myself a rational person. Logic and reason guide my life, and ghost stories? They were nothing but entertainment. But that night, I questioned everything I thought I knew. It started with a simple decision to house sit for my best friend Lisa. She had to leave town on short notice, and knowing I could use a break from my cramped apartment, she asked if I'd stay at her place for a week. Her house was cozy, sitting on the edge of a quiet suburban neighborhood, surrounded by tall trees that seemed to cradle the home in a blanket of privacy. The first couple of nights were uneventful. I spent my evenings binge-watching shows on Lisa's oversized TV and enjoying her fully stocked fridge. The peace and solitude were a welcome change. But by the third night, things started to feel off. I remember that evening vividly. The sun had set, casting long shadows across the living room walls. I had just finished dinner and was settling in with a glass of wine when I heard a faint tapping sound coming from upstairs. At first, I thought it might be the house settling, or maybe a tree branch brushing against a window. But the sound persisted, steady and deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. Curiosity got the better of me. I climbed the stairs slowly, each creak of the wooden steps echoing in the silent house. The tapping grew louder as I approached Lisa's bedroom. My heart was pounding by the time I reached her door. I hesitated for a moment before pushing it open. The room was dark, the only light coming from the street lamp outside, casting a faint glow through the curtains. I scanned the room but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Just as I was about to leave, the tapping started again. This time, it was coming from her closet. A chill ran down my spine. I'd always thought closets were inherently creepy, but standing there in the dark, the sound so close, I felt paralyzed. Gathering every ounce of courage I had, I reached for the closet door and flung it open. The tapping stopped. The closet was empty. I stood there, my breath shallow, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Maybe it was a trick of the mind, I told myself, or perhaps a noise from outside that had echoed strangely through the house. Shaking it off, I closed the closet door and went back downstairs. But the uneasy feeling stayed with me. It felt as though I was being watched, even though I was alone. I tried to distract myself with a movie, but my eyes kept darting to the shadows in the corners of the room. The night dragged on, and when I finally went to bed, I left the hallway light on, something I hadn't done since I was a kid. I woke up sometime after midnight to the sound of footsteps. They were faint, almost imperceptible, but distinct enough to jolt me awake. My first thought was that Lisa had come home early, but when I called out her name, the house fell silent. I grabbed my phone and checked the security app she'd set up. All the doors were locked, and the cameras showed nothing unusual. Still, the footsteps had sounded so real. I decided to investigate, armed with the nearest weapon I could find, a heavy-duty flashlight from Lisa's kitchen drawer. I moved cautiously, checking every room, every closet, every corner. Nothing. Yet, the feeling of being watched grew stronger, almost oppressive. That's when I noticed something strange in the living room. One of the photos on Lisa's mantle had been turned around, the image now facing the wall. I was certain it hadn't been like that earlier. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead as I turned the photo back around. It was a picture of Lisa and me at our last birthday party. My smile looked wrong, distorted somehow. I blinked and looked again, and everything seemed normal. By now, I was thoroughly spooked. I locked myself in the guest bedroom and left the lights on, refusing to sleep. The rest of the night passed without incident, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, like the house itself was alive and aware of me. The next morning, I tried to rationalize the events. Sleep deprivation, an overactive imagination, maybe even a small animal that had somehow gotten inside. But deep down, I knew these explanations didn't add up. Something wasn't right, and I was determined to figure it out. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the house into shadow once more, I prepared myself for whatever was coming. Little did I know, the true horror was just beginning. As darkness enveloped the house, I decided to conduct a more thorough investigation. I started with the attic. Lisa had mentioned that she rarely went up there, and I wondered if perhaps an animal had taken up residence. I climbed the narrow stairs leading to the attic, the old wooden planks groaning under my weight. The air grew colder as I ascended, and the smell of dust and aged wood filled my nostrils. When I pushed open the attic door, the space was pitch black, save for the narrow beam of light from my flashlight. Boxes were stacked haphazardly, their labels faded with time. As I stepped further in, the tapping sound returned, louder and more erratic. It seemed to be coming from the far corner of the attic. I made my way toward the sound, my flashlight trembling in my grip. Then I saw it. A small wooden box, no bigger than a shoebox, sitting alone on the floor. The tapping was emanating from within. My pulse raced as I knelt down to inspect it. The box was old, its surface covered in strange, intricate carvings that didn't look like any language I recognized. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the lid. Every instinct screamed at me to leave it alone, but curiosity overpowered fear. I opened the box. Inside was a collection of photographs. They were black and white, the edges worn and yellowed with age. Each photo depicted the same figure, a tall, shadowy silhouette standing in various parts of the house. The figure was faceless, its form blurred, as if it didn't belong in the frame. One photo in particular made my blood run cold. It was a picture of the guest bedroom where I had slept the night before. The shadowy figure stood at the foot of the bed, staring directly at the camera. I dropped the box and stumbled backward, my flashlight clattering to the floor. The tapping had stopped, replaced by a deafening silence that pressed down on me. And then I heard it. A whisper, faint but unmistakable, right next to my ear. "Get out." I didn't need to be told twice. I bolted out of the attic, slamming the door behind me. My heart was pounding as I grabbed my things and left the house, not even bothering to lock up. Whatever was in that house, it wasn't meant to be disturbed. Lisa called me the next day, confused and a little upset that I had left without an explanation. I didn't have the heart to tell her the full story, so I just said there had been an emergency. She told me she'd check the house later and thanked me for staying as long as I did. I haven't spoken to her about it since, but every now and then, I'll catch a glimpse of a shadow in the corner of my eye or hear faint tapping when I'm alone. And I can't help but wonder if whatever was in that house followed me home. Hello again, everyone. The next story is another chilling tale from a listener who sent in their experience. It's one of those stories that makes you rethink the idea of being alone at home. As always, I'll warn you, turn on the lights because this one is going to get under your skin. I'll begin by saying that I've always been a skeptic when it comes to the paranormal. Strange noises, shadows in the dark eye could explain them all away. At least, I used to, until the night I stayed at my late grandmother's house. Her house was old nearly a century, built by her father. After she passed, it had been left empty for months. My family debated what to do with it, and I was asked to stay there for a weekend to sort through her belongings. It seemed simple enough, and I thought the solitude would be peaceful. How wrong I was. The house was exactly as she'd left it. The furniture covered in white sheets, the air heavy with the scent of mothballs and faded memories. As I walked through the rooms, I felt a strange mix of nostalgia and unease. It was like the house was holding its breath, waiting for something. I started in the attic. It was the most cluttered space, filled with boxes of old photographs, letters, and trinkets. As I sifted through the memories of a life long lived, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the room in shadows. I hadn't noticed how quiet the house had become until I heard a faint creak, like footsteps on the floorboards below. "Hello?" I called out, my voice breaking the silence. No answer. I told myself it was nothing, maybe the house settling or an animal outside. Still, I locked the attic door before heading downstairs. By the time I made it to the living room, night had fallen. I turned on a few lamps, their dim glow barely pushing back the darkness. As I unpacked more boxes, I found a photograph of my grandmother as a young woman standing in front of the house. She looked happy, but there was something odd about the picture. In the background, at one of the windows, was a faint shadow. It looked like a person, but blurred, indistinct. I stared at the photo for a long time, trying to convince myself it was just a trick of the light. Then came the knock. 3 sharp raps at the front door. Startled, I dropped the photo. The knock came again, louder this time. My heart raced as I approached the door. Through the peephole, I saw nothing but the dark, empty porch. I hesitated, then opened the door. The night was cold, the air still. Nobody was there. But as I turned to close the door, I noticed something on the ground, a small, folded piece of paper. Picking it up, I unfolded the note. Written in shaky, uneven handwriting were the words, "You're not alone." A chill ran down my spine. I slammed the door and locked it, double-checking every window and door in the house. My rational mind struggled to make sense of it. A prank, I told myself. Someone trying to scare me. But deep down, I knew better. The rest of the night passed in a haze of fear. Every creak, every shadow felt like a threat. I slept with the lights on, clutching a heavy flashlight like a weapon. When morning finally came, I felt foolish. In the daylight, the house seemed harmless, even welcoming. But the next night was worse. The second evening began uneventfully. I busied myself in the kitchen, sorting through old cookware and mismatched plates. I put on some music to drown out the eerie silence, convincing myself that last night had been my imagination. Yet, as the sun disappeared, so did my sense of security. I was washing a teacup when the lights flickered. Just a brief dimming, but enough to send my nerves on edge. I glanced around the room, trying to shake off the unease. Then, the music stopped abruptly, replaced by static. I rushed to the living room to check the stereo, but before I could reach it, I heard a voice. Faint, garbled, like a whisper coming through the static. I froze, straining to make out the words, but they were unintelligible. Then, the static cut off, and the house fell silent again. "This is ridiculous," I muttered to myself, though my hands were shaking. I decided to call my mom, hoping the sound of a familiar voice would call me. As the phone rang, I paced the living room. But when she answered, the connection was filled with crackling noise. "Hello? Mom?" I said. Her reply came through, distorted but clear enough. "Get out of the house." I stopped cold. "What? Mom, are you okay?" There was no response, just static. Then the line went dead. My stomach churned as I stared at the phone. I tried calling back, but the call wouldn't go through. The knock came again. 3 sharp raps, this time from the back door. Gripping my flashlight, I moved cautiously to the kitchen. The door's frosted glass made it impossible to see who or what was outside. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to sound braver than I felt. No answer. I held my breath and unlocked the door, yanking it open. The backyard was empty, bathed in moonlight. My grandmother's old swing set creaked as the wind picked up, but there was no sign of anyone. And then I felt Ita's presence behind me, spinning around. I saw nothing, but the air felt heavy, oppressive. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I slowly backed into the house, locking the door behind me. My heart was pounding as I checked every room, every corner. Nothing. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. By now, sleep was out of the question. I huddled on the couch, flashlight in hand, jumping at every little sound. Hours passed, and the unease grew stronger. Then, at exactly 3 a.m., the attic door creaked open on its own. My blood ran cold. I stared at the dark opening, willing myself to move, but fear rooted me in place. A faint thump echoed from above, followed by the sound of something being dragged across the floor. I wanted to run, to get out of the house, but I couldn't leave without knowing what was up there. Summoning every ounce of courage, I climbed the stairs, each step feeling like a march to my doom. The attic door was ajar, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. I raised my flashlight, its beam cutting through the shadows. The attic was exactly as I'd left it, except for the wooden rocking chair in the corner. It was moving, creaking back and forth as if someone invisible was sitting in it. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice trembling. The chair stopped. The silence was deafening. Then, from the darkness, a voice whispered, "Leave now." That was it. I bolted down the stairs, grabbed my keys, and fled the house. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away. When I finally pulled over, my hands were still shaking. The next day, I told my family I couldn't stay there any longer. I didn't tell them why. How could I? They'd never believe me. But I know what I experienced. Something is in that house, something that doesn't want to be disturbed. And now, whenever I'm alone at night, I can't shake the feeling that it followed me. Hello everyone. Tonight, I've got another spine-tingling tale to share with you. This one comes from a listener who had an experience they'll never forget. If you're someone who loves peaceful getaways to remote cabins, this story might make you think twice. I had always loved the idea of escaping to a secluded cabin for a weekend. No emails, no noise, just me, my journal, and the serenity of nature. When I found a listing for a cabin by a lake deep in the woods, it seemed like the perfect retreat. The drive there was beautiful. The road wound through dense forests, sunlight filtering through the trees. By the time I reached the cabin, the sky was beginning to turn golden with the setting sun. It was small but cozy, with a wraparound porch overlooking the still, glassy lake. I felt a sense of calm wash over me as I unpacked my things and settled in. The first night was uneventful. I cooked dinner, read for a while, and then sat on the porch, listening to the sounds of the forest. The distant hoot of an owl, the rustling of leaves in the breezite was all so soothing. I went to bed feeling content, certain I'd made the right choice coming here. But by the second night, things started to feel off. It began with small, almost imperceptible things. While I was making tea, I noticed the kitchen window was slightly open. I was sure I hadn't touched it. Then, as I was journaling by the fire, I thought I heard faint footsteps outside. At first, I told myself it was an animal, but the steps were deliberate, human-like, crunching on the gravel path near the cabin. I turned off the lights and peered out the window, straining to see through the darkness. The forest was quiet, the lake perfectly still. Nothing seemed out of place, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Later that night, I woke up to a soft knocking sound. It was coming from the front door. My heart raced as I grabbed my phone and checked the time. 3:12 a.m. Who could possibly be out here at this hour? I stayed in bed, holding my breath, hoping whoever it was would go away. The knocking stopped, replaced by silence. Just as I was starting to relax, I heard it again, this time from the back door. I'd locked both doors before bed, but now I wasn't so sure. Summoning my courage, I tiptoed to the living room, flashlight in hand. The back door was locked, just as I'd left it. Relieved, I turned to head back to bed when I caught a glimpse of something through the window. A figure, standing at the edge of the lake, motionless. My flashlight's beam barely reached them, but I could make out their silhouette tall, lanky, and unnervingly still. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The figure didn't move, didn't respond. After what felt like an eternity, they turned and walked slowly into the forest, disappearing into the shadows. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of the trees outside kept me on edge. By morning, I convinced myself it had been a hiker or a camper who'd gotten lost. Still, I couldn't shake the eerie feeling that something wasn't right. That evening, I decided to leave the next morning. I spent the day packing up and cleaning, eager to get back to civilization. As the sun set, painting the lake in shades of orange and pink, I tried to distract myself by watching the reflections on the water. But then I noticed something, the reflection of a figure standing behind me on the porch. My blood ran cold. I spun around, but no one was there. The porch was empty. Panicked, I grabbed my keys and bolted the doors, locking every window and pulling the curtains closed. I sat in the living room, clutching a kitchen knife, every nerve in my body on high alert. Hours passed. The forest outside was deathly quiet, the kind of silence that presses on your ears. Just when I thought I might be safe, the knocking started again. This time, it came from all around the front door, the back door, the windows, a frantic, rhythmic pounding that echoed through the cabin. "Leave me alone," I screamed, but the knocking continued, relentless and unyielding. The walls seemed to vibrate with the sound, and I felt like I was losing my mind. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence was deafening. I sat there, trembling, tears streaming down my face, too scared to move. When dawn finally broke, I didn't waste a second. I grabbed my bags, jumped in my car, and sped away, not daring to look back at the cabin. It happened a few years ago, back when I was living alone in a small, single-story house on the outskirts of town. The kind of place that's cozy during the day, but turns unsettlingly quiet at night. I'd been there for 6 months, and while I'd grown used to the solitude, something about that house always felt off. You know how some places have a certain energy? This one had an emptiness, as though it were waiting for something or someone. It started innocuously enough, a tapping sound at the window late one evening. I'd been sitting on the couch, scrolling mindlessly through my phone, when I heard faint, rhythmic tap, tap, tap. At first, I thought it might be a tree branch swaying in the wind, but when I glanced outside, I saw nothing but the shadowy outline of my yard. The street lamp at the end of the driveway barely illuminated the surrounding darkness, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was just beyond the edge of the light. I shrugged it off and went back to my phone, but the tapping continued. This time, it was louder, more insistent. My stomach tightened. I walked to the window and peered out. But again, there was nothing there. No tree branches, no animals, no signs of movement at all. I even stepped outside for a moment, letting the cold night air bite at my skin as I looked around. Silence. Just the occasional chirp of a cricket and the rustling of leaves. I locked the door tightly when I went back inside. The next few nights were quiet, and I began to forget about the incident. Until it happened again. This time, the tapping came from the back of the house. It was almost midnight, and I was lying in bed when I heard it. Tap, 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 deliberate and measured. My heart pounded as I grabbed the flashlight from my nightstand and crept toward the back door. I shone the light through the window, but as before, there was nothing to see. I checked the lock, making sure it was secure, and returned to bed. But sleep didn't come easily that night. My ears strained for any sound, and every creak of the house sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. The third time it happened, I knew something was wrong. I'd just gotten home from work and was putting away groceries when I noticed the tapping again. This time, it wasn't just a few faint sounds. It was persistent, almost frantic, and coming from the living room window. My hands shook as I grabbed my phone, ready to call someone, anyone but. When I stepped into the living room, the noise stopped. The room was empty, the curtains undisturbed, but I noticed something chilling, a faint smudge on the glass, like a handprint pressed against the window from the outside. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next day, I installed cameras around the house. I didn't tell anyone about what had been happening. I didn't want to sound paranoid, but I needed proof. I needed to know if someone was stalking me or if my mind was playing tricks on me. For a week, everything was quiet. No tapping, no handprints, nothing. I checked the footage every morning, and it always showed the same thing. An empty yard, still and silent in the dark. I began to think maybe it was all in my head, the result of stress or an overactive imagination, until one night I woke up to the sound of tapping again. But this time, it wasn't at the window, it was coming from inside the house. I froze in bed, every muscle in my body tense. The tapping was soft but distinct, like fingernails lightly drumming on wood. It was coming from the hallway, just outside my bedroom door. My heart raced as I reached for the flashlight and crept out of bed. I held my breath, listening intently. The sound stopped for a moment, and the silence was deafening. Then, a single knock-sharp and deliberate T-code through the house. It wasn't coming from the hallway anymore. It was coming from the kitchen. I tiptoed down the hall, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, as though the house itself were holding its breath. When I reached the kitchen, I found nothing out of place. The doors were locked, the windows shut tight. But as I turned to leave, a chill ran down my spine. On the kitchen table, there was a single piece of paper. I knew I hadn't left it there. My hands trembled as I picked it up and unfolded it. Scrawled across the page in shaky, uneven handwriting were 3 words: "Let me in." I dropped the paper and backed away, my mind racing. Who had been in my house? How had they gotten in? I checked the cameras again, frantically scrolling through the footage, and that's when I saw it. At exactly 3:12 a.m., the camera facing the back door captured something. A figure, tall and shadowy, standing just outside the door. They didn't move, didn't try to open it. They just stood there, staring at the camera. And then, as if aware I was watching, they raised a hand and tapped on the glass. Tap, tap, tap. I couldn't make out their face. It was obscured by darkness. But their presence was undeniable. They lingered for a few minutes before stepping back into the shadows and disappearing. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I packed a bag and left the house. I never went back. It started on a chilly autumn evening. I was home alone for the weekend, something I usually looked forward to. My parents had gone to visit relatives, leaving me in charge of the house. I was 23, not exactly a kid, so it wasn't a big deal. The fridge was stocked, the Wi-Fi was working, and I had a weekend of uninterrupted solitude ahead of me. The first few hours were uneventful. I binge-watched a series, snacked on popcorn, and even considered starting a new book. It was past midnight when I finally decided to call it a night. As I turned off the lights downstairs and climbed up to my bedroom, a strange sensation washed over me. It felt as if something was watching me. I laughed it off, convincing myself it was just the eerie quietness of the house playing tricks on me. But as I reached the top of the stairs, I swore I heard a faint creak behind me. I froze, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure whoever or whatever was there could hear it too. Turning around slowly, I scanned the darkness below. The living room was empty, its furniture cloaked in shadows. The only sound was the soft hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. Shaking my head, I muttered, "Get a grip," and headed to my room. I locked the door knot, something I usually did, but the unease lingered. I climbed into bed, pulling the covers up to my chin. My eyes darted to the door repeatedly, waiting for something to happen. But eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted off to sleep. I woke up around 3 a.m. to a noise. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct, a soft tapping, like fingertips drumming against a hard surface. I held my breath, straining to hear. The sound was coming from downstairs. Grabbing my phone, I turned on the flashlight and crept to my bedroom door. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate. I debated calling someone, my parents, a neighbor, but I didn't want to overreact. Instead, I unlocked the door and stepped into the hallway, every nerve in my body on edge. The tapping stopped. I froze in place, waiting, listening. The house was so silent, it felt like the air itself was holding its breath. Slowly, I made my way to the top of the stairs and peered down. The living room was bathed in pale moonlight, streaming through the windows. Nothing seemed out of place. But then, just as I was about to head back to bed, I saw it. A shadow. Not a natural one cast by the furniture or the moonlight. This shadow moved. It slithered along the floor like it had a life of its own, creeping toward the staircase. I stood frozen at the top of the stairs, gripping my phone tightly. My flashlight beam wavered, but the shadow didn't falter. It moved unnaturally, gliding without a source, as if it were alive. My breath caught in my throat, and I instinctively backed away, my bare feet brushing against the cool wood of the hallway. Suddenly, the shadow stopped at the base of the staircase. It didn't rise or dissipate. Instead, it seemed to linger, waiting. The air felt heavier now, like the house itself was holding something sinister within its walls. I whispered to myself, "It's just your imagination." Saying it aloud didn't help. I turned and hurried back into my room, locking the door behind me. My chest was heaving, but I forced myself to stay calm. I told myself I'd imagined the whole thing, an overactive mind conjuring horrors in the dark. But then came the knock. 3 slow, deliberate taps against my bedroom door. My heart stopped. The knock wasn't loud, but it was purposeful, as if whoever or whatever was on the other side wanted to make sure I knew they were there. My body trembled as I stared at the door. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. All I could do was listen. The knock came again, this time softer, but somehow more menacing. I finally found my voice and called out, "Who's there?" My voice cracked, betraying my fear. No answer. I glanced at my phone, my fingers fumbling to dial 911. But as soon as I pressed the call button, the knocking stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I waited, my heart pounding, my phone still clutched in my hand. After what felt like an eternity, I gathered the courage to approach the door. I pressed my ear against it, straining to hear any sign of movement. Nothing. I thought about calling the police, but what would I even say? That I saw a shadow and heard knocks? It sounded ridiculous. Instead, I grabbed the heaviest object I could find, a metal lamp, from my nightstand and unlocked the door. The hallway was empty. I took a hesitant step out, my flashlight illuminating the walls. Everything looked normal, too normal. The kind of normal that felt forced, like the house was hiding something. And then I saw it. On the floor, just outside my bedroom door, were faint smudges. They looked like fingerprints, black and greasy, as if someone or something had dragged their fingers along the floor. The trail led down the hallway, disappearing into the shadows at the staircase. I didn't dare follow it. Instead, I bolted back into my room, locking the door again. This time, I shoved a chair under the doorknob for good measure. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Every creak, every gust of wind made me jump. The knocking didn't return, but the unease never left. When morning finally came, the sunlight streaming through my window felt like a lifeline. I hurried downstairs, desperate to shake off the nightmare of the night before. But the living room was different. The furniture had been moved subtly, but enough for me to notice. The coffee table was skewed to the side. The couch cushions were out of place, and the kitchen chair I'd left at the table was now lying on its side. And on the floor, near the base of the staircase, was a single black handprint. I stared at the black handprint, my mind racing. It was larger than any human hand I'd ever seen, unnaturally long fingers, the smudges trailing off like wisps of smoke. The air in the house felt stifling, as if it were pressing down on me, urging me to leave. But where would I go? It was broad daylight, and the logical part of me wanted to believe there was an explanation for everything that had happened. Maybe someone had broken in. Maybe the noises and the shadow were tricks of the mind. Still, I grabbed a knife from the kitchen drawer and began a thorough sweep of the house. Room by room, I searched. Closets, under beds, behind doors, nothing. Everything was in its place except for the unsettling signs left behind. The moved furniture, the greasy handprint, and the lingering feeling that I wasn't alone. By the time I finished, I was exhausted. My phone buzzed. It was my mom. I debated telling her what had happened, but decided against it. I didn't want to worry her. Instead, I lied. "Everything's fine. Have fun at Aunt Linda's." After hanging up, I decided I couldn't stay inside any longer. I grabbed my keys and left, driving aimlessly through town until I found myself parked at a cafe. I sat there for hours, sipping coffee and scrolling through my phone, trying to distract myself. When I finally returned home, the sun was setting. The house loomed ahead of me, its windows dark and unwelcoming. I hesitated at the door, knife still tucked in my bag, and stepped inside. The air felt different, colder. I flipped on every light, trying to chase away the creeping shadows. The handprint by the staircase was gone. That should have been comforting, but instead, it filled me with dread. Something or someone had cleaned it. That night, I made a decision. I wouldn't sleep in my room. Instead, I set up a makeshift bed on the living room couch where I could keep an eye on the front door. I barricaded the back door and double-checked every lock. Hours passed, and the house remained quiet. Too quiet. At some point, exhaustion overtook me, and I dozed off. I woke up to the sound of breathing. It was faint but unmistakable, shallow breaths coming from somewhere in the room. My eyes snapped open, and I lay completely still, straining to locate the source. The air was icy, and I could see my breath fogging in front of me. Slowly, I turned my head. In the corner of the room, just beyond the reach of the lamplight, something moved. It wasn't a shadow this time. It was solid, a figure. It stood hunched, its limbs too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Its eyes, or where its eyes should have been, reflected the faint light like two dark pools. I couldn't scream, couldn't move. The figure stepped forward, its movements jerky and wrong, like a puppet with tangled strings. As it drew closer, the air grew colder, and I could feel the weight of its presence pressing against my chest. Then it spoke. Its voice was a low, guttural whisper that seemed to echo inside my skull. "You let me in." I didn't remember moving, but suddenly, I was on my feet, clutching the knife from my bag. The figure didn't flinch. It just stood there, watching, its head tilting slowly from side to side. I backed toward the door, my shaking hands fumbling with the lock. As soon as I managed to wrench it open, I bolted into the night, not daring to look back. I didn't stop running until I was halfway down the block. My breath came in ragged gasps, and my legs ached, but I didn't care. I looked back at the house, its dark silhouette stark against the moonlit sky. Nothing followed me, but I could feel Itit's presence still clinging to me like a cold, suffocating fog. I pulled out my phone and called the only person I could think of, my best friend, Sarah. She answered groggily, clearly annoyed by the late-night call. "Something's in my house," I blurted out, my voice trembling. "I don't know what it is, but it's not human." There was silence on the other end. Then, "Are you serious? You're not messing with me, right?" "I'm not," I snapped, panic bubbling over. "Please, can I come over? I can't go back in there." Sarah hesitated but finally relented. "Yeah, of course. Just get here safely, okay?" The drive to her apartment felt like an eternity. Every shadow along the road seemed to move. Every sound made my heart race. By the time I arrived, I was shaking so badly I could barely get out of the car. Sarah met me at the door, her concerned expression quickly turning to alarm when she saw me. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said, ushering me inside. "I think I did," I muttered, collapsing onto her couch. I recounted everything. The shadow, the knocking, the handprint, and the figure in the corner of my living room. Sarah listened in stunned silence, her skepticism melting into fear as I described the chilling details. That's insane," she said finally. "But you're staying here tonight. No way are you going back there." I nodded, grateful for her support. For the first time in hours, I felt a glimmer of safety. But that night, the nightmare followed me. I woke up to the sound of footsteps. For a moment, I was disoriented, unsure of where I was. Then I remembered Sarah's apartment. The footsteps were faint but deliberate, moving slowly through the hallway outside the guest room. My heart sank. "Sarah?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. No answer. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. I stared at the doorknob, expecting it to turn. Instead, the door itself began to creak, the wood groaning as if something heavy was pressing against it. Then came the voice. "You can't escape." It was the same guttural whisper from my house, but now it was louder, more menacing. The air grew cold, and the room seemed to shrink around me. I grabbed my phone, desperate to call Sarah, but the screen was black. Dead. The door burst open. Standing in the doorway was the figure. Its form was clearer now, illuminated by the faint glow of moonlight from the window. Its skin was gray and mottled, stretched tightly over its bony frame, its eyes black, empty voids locked onto mine. "You brought me here," it hissed, stepping into the room. I screamed. When I came to, it was morning. Sarah was shaking me awake, her face pale and panicked. "What happened?" "You were screaming in your sleep, and when I came to check on you, you were freezing like, literally ice cold." I sat up, my body aching, and tried to explain, but the words wouldn't come. The events of the night felt like a blur, a fever dream I couldn't shake. "Let's go back to your house," Sarah said firmly. "We'll figure this out." I didn't want to go, but something told me I had no choice. When we arrived, the house was eerily quiet. It looked normal, almost inviting in the daylight, but I knew better. Inside, everything was exactly as I had left except for one thing. On the living room wall, written in black, greasy streaks, were the words, "You let me in." Sarah gasped, and I stumbled back, my head spinning. "What does that mean?" she whispered. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that whatever it wasn't done with me.